been around for decades. You know, we did a lot of work in this space in the 70s and 80s. It hasn't changed, to be honest. It's an engineering approach, and it involves a lot of planning before you. But I'll quickly go through some of these. So I was going to go through the planning because I think that's really important, and that's a bit what I find as an operative in the agriculture areas is this is a bit that we miss. We tend to see a symptom and we go straight for a solution without actually thinking through all the different options. I was going to go through the earthwork structures and designing and all that, but I might just glance over those because there's plenty. It's all on the web, and because there's less of us, my name's as a contact for all of it. So if you need any more information, you give me an email or call. And then I've actually got some slides from Dave Weaver, which are really important for this part of the world. It sort of got touched on yesterday. Someone asked about the farmer in terms of his fertilisation regime. I was going to kick in, but I didn't really know him well enough to ask some of the questions. But Dave's provided a few slides with some really good work he's done recently about the fate of our nutrients on our farms. Okay. So the main thing is everyone's got a duty of care out there. You can't do something, you know, in terms of you can't do actions on your property that adversely affect others or the environment. And that's really important and it should be up front before we do any actions. The other one is, you know, the water on a catchment or in a basin impacts your farm and the water on your farm impacts that catchment. So it's that CFC approach and thinking of it in an integrated way, not in isolation. And, you know, this is from a colleague, is the law governing the flow of water is the fact is it does flow downhill. Okay, so, you know, first thing we really need to do is collect some baseline data in terms of what is the extent of the problem, what is the frequency of the problem and things like that. You know, you look at your management options and drainage, they call it drainage, it's actually water management. You know, it's about capturing and transmitting water safely and disposing of it safely. And then you're looking, and that's one option, there's an engineering option. The other option is biological options, there's perennials, there's trees. So there's different options you can apply to the same problem. And then this is a big thing which we tend to miss is this design part. Is when we build a road, we don't give a plan, we don't just tell a construction crews, go build me a road. There's this little step in between which involves an engineer who actually looks at where the road's going, how high it has to be, how compacted. He then comes up with a design that's then given to a construction crew to build. And this is one part in rural areas that we tend not to really spend a lot of time on. Implement the options, and then it's not over. It's actually maintaining those systems that you've implemented. It's monitoring how they are performing, and it's evaluating you know, their actual impact. So water management is an actual land use in its own right, and it may require areas of the farm to be set aside. And yesterday was a classic. You know, he set aside 22 hectares for that wetland because that was what it was. He wasn't trying to farm that part anymore. And that's a bit about, and that's a sort of a principle we need to acknowledge. There's certain parts, and I think it came up in Roger's talk, that there is low yielding parts of the farm. And a lot of times we see with our modern technology, we tend to treat the earth as being flat and featureless, and it's not. So there's some parts of the farm that you have to not farm and allow for the safe passage of water. Okay, this is something we sort of developed in the 90s and the noughties, and that's, you know, if you want to break up the landscape, you know, we can break it up into all different units, but at the end of the day, there's parts of the landscape that shed water, and there's parts of the landscape that receive water, and we treat those two differently in part of that system thinking. So water flows from a shedding landscape and accumulates in a receiving landscape, and that's where we get our waterlogging, our flooding and our inundation. Sometimes it doesn't have to shed from a landscape to create those issues. Sometimes it's in situ rainfall that's causing the issue. All right, and this is a classic one, you know, and this, I mean, I've been in the game for over 30 years and it still dumbfounds me in an industry that's fairly sophisticated now, it's high tech. Any other issue on the farm, they do soil tests, they do tissue tests, they work out why is that crop yellow, They do all this deduction, they hire themselves an agronomist, goes through the results and gives you an answer. When it comes to drainage, it seems to be we open a checkbook and let some person come in with a whole pile of yellow machinery and just start digging. And yeah, and that's how it looks some days, without the excavator bogged. So each earthwork structure has a specific use, and so we're not anti-drainage, we're anti-poor design. One structure does not fit all your problems. And what I say to landholders, if you have someone come in with one type of machine to fix your problem, is just turn them around and send them back out the gate. You need to use different types of machines to build different structures. There is not one solution that fits all when it comes to drainage. It's not a drain if it's a ditch. So we got the ditch diggers, but we've actually got good drainage contractors. So there is a difference. And, you know, wrong structure in the wrong place, you're not going to make either more mess on your farm or your downstream neighbours or the receiving environment. Okay, I'm just going to glance over these. You know, there's banks where we capture and transmit water, there's drains that we transmit water down the bottom, and there's some complementary structures, and that's actually, we don't necessarily have to push the water off, we can actually harvest and store that water and use it for beneficial uses. So, you know, as I said, there's a whole pile of structures. This is a classic one, these groundwater. You see, you know, we don't use a lot of these to try to deal with salinity. They're not appropriate. Yet where I see this thing here, the deep excavated drain, being used across all these things. And then you wonder why, when they're digging 2 metres, when they could dig 20 centimetres and have the same impact. So it's about doing that, working out, well, what is driving that water problem on my farm? You know, is it a perched water table? There's a lot of areas I see ditches get dug and it's not a groundwater issue, it's just basically water sitting on top of a clay profile. Rightio, there's all the different structures. Each structure has a minimum. I'm just going to skip all the way through these. These are all designs. They've been around for a long, long time. There's a few new structures we're using, drive-through banks and things like that, but generally the design principles for each structure are the same. You know, there's a minimal grade we put on cross-section, and there's a whole pile of work we do in the background before. We don't have a preconception of the design we want. We look at what the problem is and where it is in the landscape, what your rainfall is, and then you design for a system. The other thing we do, and we've done for decades, is we don't design to deal with these large rainfall events, because the type of structures you'd need for those sort of events would be uneconomic and be that big that you've got a lot of investment sitting in the paddock waiting for the flood year. We actually only design for a 10% average exceedance probability is the new language, which would equate to a 1 in 10 year average return interval. So we actually only design for the lower rainfall years, but what we do is we design to fail safely. And the idea is when the floods come, is if you try to contain that into a channel, they will blow out. Rather than having the channel exceed its capacity, spill out safely, move through the landscape. And one of the keys to surface water management is keeping it thin and keeping it slow and let it just slowly, is what we call the time to concentration. We're not trying to shed the water off in a day. We end up with too high a velocity and too much of a slug of water moving through the system, causes degradation. We'd rather see that water be transmitted slowly over a few days as a gentle flow through the landscape. And that, you know, to be honest, these are one of my favourites. These sort of open shallow relief drains. They're nice and gentle. They're really hard to concentrate water in a nice area like that. It just actually just spills out and moves through the landscape rather than concentrate water. You get the deeper the water, the more hydraulic head you have on it, the more ability it's got to start eroding the soil at the base of the drain. Anyway, that's all design. We're going to skip over those. And this all gets down to the engineering, and I don't think this is the time to go through the maths that we use and apply for design. So, laws and the legislation, you're actually governed by quite a few different acts. Common law is a classic. You know, this is where it gets to surf. The with the common law is you don't have a right to do something on your property that adversely impacts on a neighbour to be able to utilise their land. It's the same law that governs spray drift. You can't spray your crop and have that spray drift over and kill your neighbour's crop. You can turn around and ask for some retribution in terms of paying for the damage. It's the same with water. The other one is this is the only act that my department administers. It's a Soil and Land Conservation Act. It's 1945. It's a really old act, but it's still as relevant today as it was yesterday. What that is if you've got the intent to drain water for salinity management, then it needs to be notifiable to our department, and it's not the depth of your structure. You can have a 2 centimetre deep drain. If your intent is to drain that saline land, it's notifiable, and then we actually, and it's not a approval process, it's is there any objection to your proposal? So once we receive the proposal, it's sent to the Shire, to the Department of Water and Environmental Regulation, to the Department of Biodiversity, Conservation and Attractions. I'm trying not to do acronyms. And then they have a 90 days to reply back whether they have any objection to that proposal. And then we work through how we can make sure that what you're trying to do will actually not have any adverse impact on the downstream users. And then there's Rights and Irrigation Act, which is another really old act. But then you've got the Waterways Conservation Act, Environmental Protection Act, and then there's 11 other acts which our Soil and Land Conservation Act is supplementary to or needs to be read in conjunction. So there is actually laws in place for water management. It's not a free-for-all out there. All right, so the legal considerations as the natural drainage rules is a natural watercourse can't be obstructed or diverted. And that's been around for it's been around for a long time. The other one is you can't take surface water from one catchment and decide, I'm not going to let that exit over there, I'm going to pull it over here. That's another one that gets frowned upon. And a landowner cannot accelerate the flow of water to the material damage of the lower land. And really basic stuff, but things seem to be not sometimes adhered to. So there are several acts, legal requirements that must be considered. You really got to ensure what you're doing does meet that duty of care and your common law. And this is a classic one. There was a big drainage dispute in our eastern wheat belt many moons ago, and it actually split a community. And then we've come in, and then Judge Cheney had this really nice, well, not nice, but he's basically saying it does not sanction one landholder solving his or her own land degradation problem by imposing the cost of it to his or her neighbour. You know, and that's the sort of philosophies we need to sort of pick up as, you know, in terms of natural resource management community and think a lot more. Okay, so this is Dave Weaver's slides now, and you know the conventional model for dealing with nutrients in our sandy environments was to do vegetation strips to try to filter out the nutrients going into our waterways. And what he found was, so PP is your particulate phosphorus on this side here, and then you've got your suspended sediments, and then you've got your filtered reactive phosphorus here. And what he was saying is where it's degraded, you've got lots of phosphorus coming in the particulates, and you've got lots of suspended solids also transporting that phosphorus, and there's not a lot going in. So then we do the filter strips, and it's all good if it's coming across the surface, and then you lower your phosphorus entering the stream, and there's less suspended sediments. But what he also found is in the southwest, most of the phosphorus is actually transported in that subsurface flow. So you know how that wetland yesterday was perched, sitting on the clay? So that farmer fertilising the land, there's a potential for that to get in through the perched water into your wetland and things like that. So what he was saying here is, once again, is you put your phosphorus in, but it wasn't really changing. There was still a lot of filterable reactive phosphorus getting into the waterways through those subsurface. So it was basically going underneath the filter strips, bypassing the system and getting into the waterway. But there's still good news to come. So what he was showing is he did a whole pile of soil testing around the state. So it's part of this Estuary Initiatives project that they're just coming to the back end on. And what he was showing that, you know, over here is your basically phosphorus by depth, and a lot of your phosphorus is caught up in the top layer. It's not leaching down as much as they thought. And these are all their sample locations, which does cover some of the estuaries over in Albany. And what he's found was there's a lot of phosphorus in the soil, and I think it's something like 80% of the soil samples they took indicated that they didn't need to put any more phosphorus on the paddocks. And so that was the question I wasn't brave enough to ask the farmer yesterday afternoon is, before he did his fertiliser, did he actually do a soil test to work out what fertiliser he needed, or was he just putting it on because he puts on X tonnes per hectare per year because that's what they've always been doing? So that's what David Weaver is trying to turn around. Instead of just doing fertiliser regimes, do your soil testing and then work out what fertilisers you actually need, and it's all dependent on what sort of plants and productivity you're chasing is your fertiliser regimes. So what he's saying is there's, you know, all that stuff above the line is basically sometimes you're putting too much on, and if you don't put enough on, and we've got a lot of store of phosphorus in there. So the main message is trying to get across is do your soil testing for nutrients before you apply the nutrients. And I think a lot of my friends who are grain growers, they wouldn't think of having, and they actually question some of the results, and they will argue with the fertiliser supplier to make sure that they're getting efficiencies, and they want to optimise their fertiliser programs because the stuff's not cheap, especially in the last year or two. The price has gone up, which makes a lot of sense. So, in summary, and this is really, I really want to push this, and this is where South Coast NRM Inc., the Oyster Harbours, the Wilson Inlets, this is where you come in really strongly, and you're probably in the lead area because there's no one government department that does this, so it has to be community driven, and that's to deal with surface water management in an integrated catchment way. So not do it in isolation, do it as a sub-catchment group. And that doesn't mean involving all your members in your association. It might only be dealing with 3 or 4 in one small sub-catchment, but don't do it in isolation. And, and also look at the best practice that's, for the scale of the problem, for the design, the risks and things like that. And as I said, I can't sort of push this harder, is this consultation and participation is expected for all stakeholders affected by drainage. I actually stole those 3 points from the inland drainage policy that was developed in the 90s and noughties in WA. It's there, it hasn't gone away, we just don't apply it. And the other one is, just create and maintain open communication channels. We don't go looking for trouble, trouble finds us. Most of the complaints we get is one neighbour complaining about another, or some other user like a shire who's lost a culvert because someone's used an inappropriate design. As I said, it's about looking at the appropriate designs for the appropriate part. And then the next slide is the sort of issue we face. If we leave our landscape waterlogged and inundated, we've got these problems. So it's a similar graph. This is from the South Stirlings. It was some work that Arjun and Rui and Don McFarlane were involved in the 90s, and this is some really nice type monitoring like we used to do when we did research projects. We'll go in, and obviously the project finished, but then Arjun worked out that, hang on, that's actually was telling us some good information. I don't have a lot of information for this part, so he's picked up the monitoring when he could as he was going past, right up until the Russians shot his plane out of the sky when he was coming back from long service leave. Yeah, so what this shows is in these wet years, it's these episodic rises. So the landscape is, and we're finding this from Beaumont all the way across to Albany, is you can have a linear rate of rise, so there's constant leakage, and that's usually where you've got a perch system, or you get these episodic rises. So on an average year, our farming systems are doing pretty well using all the available rainfall for productivity. But in a wet year, we've got leakage. And it's the out of season rainfall that really gives us the most leakage, because there's nothing out there in terms of from the cropping side of it that's actually using water. And so we get these rise, and they don't come back down. And so for the longer we leave a landscape waterlogged and inundated and leave that water there, then we run into these problems. And this has risen 3 metres over that 30 years, but some of these rises are nearly half a metre at a specific event. This is monthly rainfall down the bottom, and this is your depth of water table. So Don mentioned, you've got a couple of decades. This is indicating we've probably got a few more decades in this particular location. But as Bryce showed this morning, is we're getting more of these extreme events. We're getting more out-of-season rainfall. You saw that was a question I was asking Bryce about when he's analysed the annual rainfall, the winter rainfall, the summer rainfall, and the annual. And you notice there's been that shift. We've got a drying winter, and that rainfall is now occurring in summer. There's places in Esperance where actual annual rainfall has increased in the last 20 years, but our growing season rainfall has decreased, and it's coming in usually comes about harvest time, and then sometime over the summer. And it's those anticyclones that are drawing the moisture down from the north that are giving us that recharge. So, I'll put this up here to say that's what drives us to say prevention is a lot easier than cure, easier said than done, but it's fresh water when it's sitting on the top. When it comes down into the aquifer and it starts coming back to meet us, it's going to come back as saline water. It's going to be a lot more difficult to manage. And I said many moons ago, because known to be a bit of a amateur comedian, is Newton said what goes up must come down. Well, I'm saying what goes down will come back up, and that's your groundwater. So I think that's what the importance of these forums are, is to look at options, and there is lots of options there, but there is no single, simple, practical method. It actually takes innovation, it takes imagination, and it takes effort to come up with the solutions to these sorts of problems that we present. The good news we've got here is we've got time to think about it, and the ABC reporter just asked me before lunch about, we've had 2 wet years, is it too late? This was about water management. I went, no, it just means it's not about, we know the wet years we're going to have more of these events in the future. It's not if, it's when, but let's get out in front and let's think about how we can actually manage water in our landscape and so we've got 2 dilemmas now. We've got a wet landscape, but then we've got the dry landscape. So, it's about water resources, but it's about water management. And I think we've got options on the South Coast, because at the moment it's sitting on the top and it's fresh. And we've got a few, it's not imminent, the risk, but it is coming. And I'm going to, that should be it. Did I actually start?
This will come back on me, because there'll be some event, you'll ask me some similar sort of question. So, and it is a bit of a Dorothy Dix type sort of a question as well. But with the appetite amongst the farming community for regenerative agriculture, and you probably know where I'm going to go with this, and the concept of leaky weirs and what do they call it, landscape rehydration and that sort of stuff. There was a very good publication that Nick Keller, we commissioned him to do this work from UWA, and these things don't fit in all landscapes. But I was just interested in your opinion about that, John.
Okay. In terms of regeneration, I'm just going to do a politician thing here and sidetrack the question for a moment, is keeping more plants alive, more perennialisation of the landscape would, to me, as a hydrologist, is a good thing. So I just wanted to put that. The rehydrating the landscape, we did an analysis of where you could actually do that in WA. It's mostly the Darling Range, where we've got more topography, and as Don McFarlane's paper showed a couple of years ago, that the water tables are actually detached from our rivers in the Darling Range. So by putting your weaky layers there, you're actually leaking the water not into a shallow aquifer. I wouldn't be practising those on the Dalyup River in Esperance, where I've got a water table at 1 to 2 metres, because all you're going to be doing is creating salt land on each side of your weir. So once again, there's a management system there that has a place, but once again, it's not one system fits all. So yeah, so Darling Range, topographically, more topographic sort of incised country, you've probably got some options for those types of systems. I definitely wouldn't be doing it out on what we saw yesterday on those flat, relatively flat. Everything's flat in WA, but in terms of the Sandplain, because what you're doing, if you did that on the Sandplain, on a small creek, you'll be pushing. I mean, maybe Grange Resources might like it if you're pushing water into a paleo channel that they can use, and that's something we haven't even touched upon during this conference, is managed aquifer recharge, and actually, the purpose storing water for use elsewhere, and that's a whole another subject. But yeah, no, that's a good question, Tim. And I will repay you in another conference.
This is a simple question. What percentage of farms on the Albany Sandplain have these surface water control structures?
I wouldn't be able to answer that with any sort of confidence. Nick Wright has actually designed a tool where we can use the machine to identify new structures, and that's been done for our commissioner, because a lot of under the Soil and Land Conservation Act, we've got some unscrupulous contractors who tell farmers they don't need to notify. But they're not the ones who will be sued. The contractor doesn't get sued. It goes back to the landholder. So we've got a lot of unnotified drains going on in the Eastern Wheat Belt, and one way to keep on track of that is Nick's designed this tool to identify linear structures in our ag lands for the commissioner then to knock on the door and ask, where's their late bit of paperwork? And they're not big forms, they're literally 4 pages. The first 2 pages are who you are. The back page is getting your neighbour to sign to say, I'm aware of Joe Bloggs' proposal, and the other ones, they are not that hard to do, and it's a good form of due diligence that if someone comes later on in life and says, oi, that drain's caught, you can show that you've followed the correct process.
Yeah, I'm more of a comment, I guess, than a question, because I can't ask you to deal with past and current government policy, but I'm just really struck at the antiquity of the legislation that you work with.
Yeah.
I worked in New South Wales water management in New South Wales for 35 years, and the last 20 years of that was water reform, legislative reform in a whole range of areas. And I guess maybe it's something that we'll probably not talk about now, but maybe in the panel discussion about why is your current legislation fit for purpose today?
Yeah, well, they've actually reviewed it twice internally in the last decade plus. I think we've reviewed it just about every decade for the last 2 decades, and it's still relevant and required today as it was in 1945. So we've gone through the Act to look at our legislative responsibilities as a department and whether we meet them and what resources. So now there's the Soil and Land Conservation Council's been reformed. They've actually done some amendments to the Act last year in terms of just tightened up a few areas, and they're actually one of their charters is to review the Act and make those changes as required with community consultation. So it is on the agenda. They haven't, and has been on the agenda for a number of decades, and they are in the process of using the Soil and Land Conservation Council to look at that Act.
Yeah, I just think it's having seen, I'm familiar with the National Water Initiative as well, which is also very much about legislative reform and water management across Australia. So I'm not quite sure how WA has fitted into that.
Yeah, so this one, the Soil and Land Conservation Act is about reducing or avoiding land degradation. It's not really about water supply. We've got another act in Western Australia to deal with water supplies, and that took on the Australian water reforms in the 90s, and we separated our agent. We had one agency that used to investigate, allocate, and then use the water, so they had to split that under those reforms. So you had different agencies that they separated the allocation from. So we've got the Department of Water Environmental Regulation set the limits, and then the Water Corp do the water distribution and supply. So yeah, but the Soil and Land Conservation Act purely about land degradation. So to avoid or to mitigate land degradation in the agricultural lands of Western Australia. Well, it's actually land degradation across the whole state. We get caught up outside of the ag areas, and it covers the pastoral areas as well. Yeah. But no, it's a good question though. Yeah.
Phil Wishart, I knew years ago when the Ag Department here had a fair old, where we had a lot of support from you guys, and it was a good department, and there was a whole team doing water management, and we did a bit then. I just want to make a comment that despite you having all this legislation, and not only just legislation with that, with the land clearing laws, and none of it's enforced at all. I mean, I'm a farmer, I've got a reasonable amount of land, and you can go around any area now, and farmers just do what they want, most of them. And there's still land clearing going on, there's still illegal drainage, and people say to me who've worked in the departments, who've left the departments because they get no support from the politicians. So that's just a comment, and as a farmer.
Yeah, I'm glad it's a comment. I'll have to respond. And look, I'm not going to say anything against that comment at all. Shut up, John. Yeah.
Well, it's not dissimilar, but it's really how do you marry up what you're saying with this whole, water strategy that you're talking about and the practices that are actually out there, and the fact that people are purposely now just going into industrial sort of sowing and industrial systems, and it's, the landscape is so hard nowadays, and particularly you get into that eastern wheatbelt area where there's only 3% vegetation now, and there's no encouragement to soften that, either for livestock production or for cropping production, and also then, the part of that whole water management system.
Yes, no, I couldn't agree with you more. It is a challenge, and it is, and the thing is, we can't do the conservation and isolation of the production. You have to work it's the old triple bottom line. It's economics, it's environment, and it's society. And you deal with one, the others are going to be the losers at the end of the day. And that's always been a struggle. One of the good things I've seen happen probably over the last decade or two is that sort of we had isolated groups. There was a Landcare group, there was a bird watchers group, there was a production group, where now some communities, like Rain in particular in Ravensthorpe, the Ravensthorpe Agriculture Initiative Network actually have all those groups represented at one table. And when they do field days, they don't just do production field days. They actually incorporate the other aspects, and those groups really pump. And I think the groups that are being driven by the grassroots level are the ones that have the momentum. I've seen time and again where we've planted a government operative into a catchment group, and you've got a project officer. They're all good for 3 years till the project runs out. But these ones that are being employed by the local community are the ones that I think are there for longevity. But that we've always got that dilemma and that compromise between the production and the conservation side. And it's still going. It probably was happening in your days, Murray, back in Cascades and back in the 80s and 90s. Yeah, and especially with, that 2022, it was quite surprising, that arts dot, how quickly that shot up. But, you're 9 metres down, and a lot of, people are thinking more forward. It's not just a seasonal thinking anymore. People are looking more into the long term and their plans. But that's still a long way away. Well, not a long way, it's decades away. But, and then people, it's hard to get that motivation of something that may occur in the future. Done?
That is it.
Thank you.